Welcome, everybody. Nice to have you all here. I'm Jonathan Gertler. I'm having the privilege and pleasure of moderating today's panel. And we have about an hour of discussion, or 45 minutes of discussion, around many subjects, the current state of the art in the financial markets and regulatory markets and real estate markets and development, M&A, you name it, we're going to cover it today. But I wanted to just make the plea, and I don't know if we have any means of people that are streaming this versus actually physically present, but I'm from New York originally, which means that I only speak if I'm actively interrupting someone or being interrupted. So please utterly feel free to interrupt us, ask questions. Let's make this as interactive as possible. We're going to start with introductions of who we are. I'm going to ask the audience a couple questions about who you are in just a moment. But David, why don't we start on your end and we'll go from there.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Rosenbaum, Chief Development Officer at Ardelyx. I've been working in the industry for 30 years. And in my time, I've worked in small biotech, publicly traded companies. And in the same period, I've worked on 4 drugs that are on the market right now. So, we're really glad to be here, and I look forward to this interaction.
Thank you. I'm Carolina Alarco. I'm the founder and principal at BioStrategy Advisors, which is a consulting firm in Boston working with small startups, biotech startups, in everything from company formation to corporate strategy, pipeline prioritization, and investor readiness. I have 25 years in the biotech industry. Started my career here in Cambridge at Genzyme, where I was for 15 years. I was the vice president of international there. And then I worked at Igerion and Novelion as a president. We actually went public with those companies and exited. So very nice to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vikas Goyal. I've been working in the industry for about 20 years now, doing a mix of venture capital and business development. I'm currently launching a new biotech venture fund called Trek Venture Partners. I also spent 10 years investing in Series A and Series B companies at SR1. I also spent a number of years doing business development, most recently at Pandion Therapeutics.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yanni Sippis. I'm a Senior Vice President at WS Development, and I oversee the development of the Boston Seaport Project. It's the largest private development project in the history of the city of Boston, but more germane to today's conversation, the Seaport District is, outside of Kendall Square, one of the greatest hubs and clusters of both life sciences, biotech, and other knowledge-based economies on the planet. And so it's been really exciting over the past 10 or so years to see that district emerge very rapidly as the hub of that type of economic and knowledge activity.
And I'll just comment before I introduce myself that I moved to Boston 40 years ago for vascular surgery fellowship at the MGH, and our first dinner was at Anthony's Pier 4, and all that was there was that and a bunch of parking lots.
And the parking was $1.50.
It was remarkable. So times have changed. So as I said, my name is Jonathan Gertler. I'm the CEO and founding partner of Back by Life Science Advisors, which is a boutique but global firm that is an integrated strategy consulting and investment banking firm. We also recently combined in a very meaningful way with DNB, which is a global investment bank headquartered in Oslo, but with presence really around the world, including a very strong New York and a US presence. And on that integrated platform, we really run the range from early stage companies with very meaningful strategic challenges through licensing, partnering, M&A, large corporate lending, and public offerings. So it is a fully integrated platform that is really cushioned by our strategy consulting, which addresses global firms down to the small and emerging firms. My own background is a lot of years in academic medicine, followed by some serial entrepreneurship, involvement in venture, and leading healthcare investment banks before forming Back by Life Science Advisors. So let me just check with the audience that's in the room, because I can't see who's streaming us. How many of you are involved in early stage companies? How many of you, and let's start with that one. How many in the audience are early stage? And are you on the R&D side, or are you on the business development side, the leadership side? Just call it out.
Business development.
Business development? R&D? Terrific. Leadership? Great, thanks. And larger companies in the room? Which one? I've heard of it. Terrific. And I saw that hand as well.
Yeah, we're a consultancy. We work with all size companies.
Terrific. So we've heard it's a mixed audience with R&D, business development, large and small company present, which is about what this panel represents also, I think. So we're all well matched.
Any students in the audience? Or professors or academic folks? No. Okay.
Just a bunch of pedantic people here on the panel.
So we can keep it real then. All right.
So I don't know if anyone's noticed, it's been an interesting funding environment lately. Shall we start there? So Vikos and Carolina, let's start with you, whoever wants to jump right in there. There's the ecosystem of raising capital for a fund, having that fund help companies raise capital, and then those companies moving forward. And it's, what would you say, Carolina, been duck soup lately, nothing like it, incredibly easy?
It's been super easy couple of years. No, I think everybody knows. I don't need to tell anyone, but it's so hard to find capital and to fund these startups, even if you have wonderful science, wonderful founders, and a great idea and a great track record. It is hard. So if you have none of those, forget about it. You can't do it. But I hope things are getting better. We've seen a couple of great exits this year, well, more than a couple. I think that they were great, significant exits, although you could argue they were a little undervalued. But biotech is going to come back, I'm sure, and venture capital is going to come back with fresh capital, hopefully, and we're going to get to see a lot more of these great ideas in science brought forward to patients, which is what is important.
So I think just at a macro level, like we're destroying money, right, in the world. So M2 supply went up quite a lot over the last 5 years, and now it's shrinking because we're fighting inflation, and inflation's really bad. Like I was a kid, but I remember hearing my parents talk about mortgage rates in the 15 to 25%, and how did the world even work? But that was the way it was, right? And we don't want to get back to that. So we want the Fed to fight inflation and make sure we don't get back to that. And one of the ways they're doing that is by literally destroying money, right? So the money supply is disappearing into the ether. And that's just going to make financing harder, right? When you take money away, it's going to hurt the highest risk stages of innovation the most. And our industry in particular, I think more than many other industries, biotech takes capital, turns it into data, which ultimately leads to product approvals and EPS, right? But we really need that capital at the beginning. So I think we also struggle because we're so capital dependent, right? So at the macro level, like that's what's happening in the world, and it's going to take another year or two, in my opinion, right? We'll see what happens. And then, so the people who have the money, pension funds, large endowments, the charitable institutions, these are ultimately the sources of capital that are then funneling into venture funds, into hedge funds, and then back into companies. They're struggling right now. Like money's disappearing. And it doesn't really matter. Like if you have a normal person kind of retirement account and, the stock market's down a little bit, okay, like that's okay. But if you are sitting on a $500 billion in asset and the stock market's down a lot, it really hurts, right? And you're still funding your charitable institution. So you still need to take, I have a friend who's an alum of a school where she's sitting on the advisory board. She's a background in finance. And their endowment needs to send $5 million to their school every year. And they're not making $5 million in returns right now. So like, where is that going to come from? They're just depleting their assets, right? So that's just the situation that those people are dealing with. And things are slowly starting to improve. So, I actually thought the valuations for some of the acquisitions recently were great. Column Group generated $1 billion in proceeds from the acquisition of Carmo by Roche. So that money is going to go back to their limited partners, and it's going to funnel back into the economy, right? The bigger issue is that biotech is a very small portion, right? So what's hurting us also indirectly is like the Instacart IPO was not that great, and the RM IPO was like okay, and it wasn't really a lot of exits, right? My understanding is that people weren't so excited about Klaviyo's IPO. So these kind of big tech industry issues indirectly also come back to us in biotech as well. And it's just going to take some time for all that to filter through.
And David, let me turn to you for a second on that, and thanks, because the biotech is very much of a financial risk transfer approach, which is not pejorative. It is the fact that you, in order to obtain funding for the next level of drug development, and we're limiting the conversation at the moment to biotech, but I think we can easily talk about medtech or health tech as well, all of which have very different criteria. But David, the perspective of somebody who's developed drugs in large and small companies, give us a little bit of cycle perspective also with regard. Vikas is talking about macroeconomic factors. They're certainly present. Exits that may or may not be positive for the biotech space. What are going to be the drivers of cyclical change? Because it's going to happen. There's no question.
I mean, there's so many factors there.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, for the small biotech company, you put every dime into showing that phase 2 result. I mean, you'll do whatever it takes to raise the money to show a phase 2 result that you can then fund on past there. But and I know we'll speak about this more, but with the IRA, things have changed even more. So you have to look at what disease state are you in, how large is the market there, how much can you price your drug. So I think it's an ever evolving, but those companies that are public and that can raise money through ATMs, through other sources, aren't really having a hard time right now because there's money out there. But it's the earlier stage where I think it's really hurting, much worse.
I think so. Yanni, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about real estate, but just give us your impression of what the capital resourcing is at the moment, given its impact on your business. Then I'm going to make a couple comments as well about the venture environment.
Sure. Sounds an awful lot like the real estate business, what all of your industry is going through. Having said that, this probably hasn't been a time in very recent memory where great science, just like great real estate, has been less expensive, for folks who do have the capital to deploy. And so we were just talking about this before. There are a few groups around the world, whether they're a sovereign wealth fund or sovereign bank or one or two other sources that have seen fit during this down environment to really go on a buying spree or an investment spree. And this is certainly, as history has shown, every time there's a cycle, there's always a really opportunistic moment. And we're seeing that right now in the real estate business, where there's a perception that we're sort of hitting rock bottom, especially for some of the Class B assets and assets where the pandemic has had a significant impact, like the office environment. And so you're beginning now to see any sources of capital go on an acquisition spree, because that real estate can be had for perhaps dimes, not pennies, but dimes on the dollar. The exits that we've seen this year certainly aren't dimes on the dollar, but the valuations are much lower than they would have been 12, 18, 24 months ago in all of our businesses. So there's a lot of parallels in that regard.
Yeah, and I wanted to make one comment about the investment community, and I'm also a partner in a late stage health tech med tech fund as well that is currently raising it's a fifth fund in the cycle. But it was an anecdote from years ago. I was a young academic, sort of migrating over to this side of the fence, and I was with the senior partner of the very large fund in which I was a venture partner while still very full-time at the MGH. I had a job-to-child ratio of 1-to-1, and I had 3 children, which was really a mistake, is all I can tell you. But the senior partner turned to a young principal in the fund and said, "What's our job?" And the young principal said, "Our job is to fund innovation to create great companies." He said, "No, that's absolutely not true. Your job is to return capital to the limited partners who have given you capital." And as a partner of mine says, they bring us large piles of money, and we have to return larger piles of money to them. So we should never forget that venture capital or growth capital, private equity, the public markets, those are all asset classes. And they're run by asset managers, which is not to diminish the intelligence or the perception or the scientific acumen of the people in the biotech or medtech or health tech field. But the job is to return capital to the investors. And with that, they all play in lanes because they have restrictions on what they are chartered to do, because their limited partners give them really are part of their overall investment hypothesis. And so therefore, attracting capital, you have to be within the lane. You can't expect them to deviate from the lane. And when capital is constrained, as it has been, then it's critically important that their current investments are protected, which means capital is reserved. and that reserved capital has to go to companies, and then raising capital becomes harder and harder and harder. So I think we should maybe, with that as backdrop, and it's not all gloom and doom, incidentally. I think if you look at the data on the public markets, 21 companies have filed S1s. It doesn't mean they're coming out yet. We've seen a couple of IPOs emerge. The venture dollars that were deployed in Massachusetts in 2023, in the United States, were not terrible. They weren't great. I mean, but it's, there is a little bit of a comeback. Capital is liberating a little bit. But this does come back, but it's going to come back with extraordinary discipline. So I'm going to, maybe David, start with you, and then let's move across this. If you're out there and you have early stage science and you're a big company that you need to fund early stage science through, or a small company just struggling, what are the criteria? And then we'll get into the business development aspects that you're also so engaged with as well.
Sure. I mean, I think the key criteria is that the results or data that you show are based on a model, whether it's in vitro, in vivo, that is predictive. So, people come up with all these newfangled ways to show a result, but everyone wants to see something that correlates to something else. And I think one of the mistakes people make is they will spend, 50% of their money on 20 animal models and doing this and that, when they could actually get human data. And human data is always better. And, just having a plan, sticking to the plan, and trying to get to that human proof of concept, whether it's a phase 1 in patient population or a small phase 2, is where you're really going to, is your inflection point. And it's where you'll be able to actually raise money in a much easier way.
Okay. Carolina, please.
Sure. No, I'm just going to follow up on what Dave said. I think the criteria I spoke about in my previous answer, which is, great science, great founders, and a great strategy that will bring your product forward and through the value creating milestones. But what you said is true. I mean, there are companies that are trying to do too much, and they are not being capital efficient. So to me, people need to focus on what they think is the best bet in their portfolio. And the best bet could be, the indication, or could be the best asset in their portfolio, and then move it to, through IND enabling studies to file an IND. And that is a phenomenal milestone. And if it gets approved and go in human trials, that's even more important of a value inflection point, I think, at this time. And this is, of course, for very early startups, right? Pre-IND startups. So I think prioritizing, being more than ever capital efficient, doing it with a small group of talented people. It doesn't need to be 50 people or so. I think that those things are the things that investors are looking for. But I don't know, maybe because you can correct me if I'm wrong.
David wants to jump in.
I just wanted to add one thing. I've seen a lot where people have an active compound or a family class. It works really great, but they don't know what it works for. And so I think you really have to do the work to understand what you're going to use it for, as opposed to saying, we have something great, it's in immunomodulator. Well, what are you going to use it for? We're not exactly sure. Those are the things where people just spend money after money, and they go down these deep holes.
In a previously rich cycle, to date myself a little bit, many years ago in a galaxy far away, there was a prominent venture group that spoke all the time about platform investment. Then the market tanked, and then the venture group spoke extensively about asset development. Then the market came back and spoke extensively about platform investment. And the bottom line is, I think where we've converged is that without indication prioritization, without a plan, without clear inflection points, and I'll comment on the public markets in a moment, you cannot raise capital. To go back to the asset manager comment, if you don't know what your money is being deployed for, how it's spent, where it gets you, and how it increases in value, you can't raise capital. But because you were chomping at the bit, I saw that one as well. So,
I'm biased. I grew up in a family of physicians, and growing up, there was it wasn't they were reading the Lancet, they were reading the Annals of Internal Medicine, right? And these were normal doctors in the community, and and there's articles, yes, but there's also advertisements. right? And that's, and that's what I remember. It's like this great innovation boils down to one slick page in the Annals of Internal Medicine. That's what sells drugs, right? And it's not that Prilosec, which we were just talking about earlier, is this great culmination of
For other
innovation,
reasons.
right? It is. It's an amazing innovation, but how many people in this audience know somebody who's had gastric surgery for an ulcer? I don't know one person. If we were having this conversation 50 years ago, all of us would have raised our hand, right? That's what Prilosec did, right? Like, what is the economic value of something like that, right? And so it's not the innovation per se, right? It's where it gets us in terms of societal impact. There is no possible way that we can provide the healthcare needs of this world without new medicines. There's nothing that has the leverage of a medicine. A pill just gets stamped out. It's the same pill every single time, right? You can ship it anywhere you want. That's leverage. So how are you going to take that innovation, turn it into a medicine, and coincidentally, that medicine is, if successful, going to drive EPS. And what Prilosec did was completely change the pharmaceutical industry, right? It was one of the first gigantic blockbusters, one of the first medicines advertised extensively to consumers. Like, this was an amazing thing, right? So just think about that. How does your innovation eventually become a product that lots and lots of people use? So think about manufacturing. How do you consistently make this thing such that millions of people could use this thing? How do I think about getting through the safety and toxicology as fast as possible to figure out, can I actually put this in millions of people? Maybe I can. Then what do I do? So just prioritize the activities that figure out if this is going to change the world or not. And the innovation itself is very important, but now you have to turn it into a product, and you have to industrialize it.
And you also have to be cognizant of the fact that first of all, not every innovation is a venture play. Shouldn't be. Some innovations need to be, even in academia, at academic levels, need to be licensed in early and worked with in different circumstances. There may be incremental plays. There may be utterly disruptive plays. You have to match the asset to the capital you seek, back to the point of how you raise this most effectively. And one interesting note at the moment, I think, in the public markets, if you look back at the great happiness of the 10-year run of remarkable biotech valuations and earlier stage companies coming out, what tanks a cycle every single time is the fact that those inflection points are not well defined, that capital is being spent too freely, that there's inadequate prioritization, and then when there are failures, as inevitably there are in our field, then investors pull back, they get spooked, and all of the money that's flowing in, because it's willing to take the risk, pulls back. And that's where you end up back in the cycle where we currently are, and will emerge again in a much more disciplined way. Let me pause here for a second, see if there are any questions in the audience, and then Yanni, I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about some of the innovations in laboratory and real estate, and then we'll come back to business development issues. But any questions in the audience? Thank you. For a moment, I thought I was in the Nordics where nobody ever asks questions.
It seems like there's a whole new paradigm in terms of what it takes for a new biotech to get to like a Series A or a Series B. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, if you don't have in vivo data, then you're not going to get through that next round. But it takes a lot of money to get to doing in vivo studies and generating that data. What's the general landscape today for going from seed to Series A and Series B, and where does the data kind of intersect with that in terms of being successful?
I'll kick it off, and then please everybody join in. I think you're right, but I think that that valley. It's not the valley of death, but it's the valley of frustration. And I would bet that everybody who's on this panel has been in that valley of frustration, has been there for a long time. It's worsened during periods of capital constraint. And although I just made fun of the Nordics for not asking questions, I'm going to praise the Nordics for one thing that they've done remarkably, which is to create government-sponsored private capital, foundation capital-based innovation hubs just to address that question. And I'll shout out actually a group we work with extensively, the Bioinnovation Institute in Copenhagen, which is funded in part by the Novo Foundation, which is just, at the moment, obviously, very, very well capitalized and will continue to be. And their goal is to provide just that type of seed capital. I think in the United States it's less organized, but we're seeing a couple of different things. We're seeing innovation hubs cropping up, not just in Kendall Square in South San Francisco and in some of the New York areas, but elsewhere. Academic centers are trying to combine with local angel groups to try to bring this forward. So I would think for those that are trying to bridge the gap to being venture ready, everything, ranging from university incubators like the Blavatnik Institute here at Harvard, through to things in North Carolina, in Texas, Huntsville, Alabama, remarkably, and throughout different hubs in Europe. Those are areas where you have to go. And then, of course, the discipline of excellence and being able to execute is what makes you competitive in that circumstance. And I would argue for the United States that the more we can do those things, the more we'll have venture-ready companies that have been well-tested, the better the venture returns we'll get accordingly. And then I think that becomes the virtuous cycle of really bringing companies forward. But it's not impossible, but it certainly is difficult. But that's true at every stage of the game. Guys, do you want to?
Yeah, no, that's exactly correct. And your question is right. So in vivo data is necessary to, for later stage fundraising. For seed capital, there are good options now. I mean, there is obviously the NIH, SBIR, STTR grant program, which is very good. The Department of Defense, the DoD, which has different funds there if your drug or your device is able to do something for defense purposes. There are also now the ARPA-H, which is still new, and we need to see how that develops and what the dynamics between the founders and the government is. We have not yet established that in the community, but I think that non-dilutive funding is very important to get you to these animal studies that you need to have to raise your Series A from institutional investors or VCs. And what is important is not to forget about the angels. I'm in 3 angel groups, in Walnut Ventures, in TBD Angels, and in the Longevity Investors Network. And things have slowed down a little bit, but there's still angel money that can help companies get to those mouse studies that they need to then come with that data that is required now by VCs to fund you. So that was my comment.
And I would caution also against non-dilutive funding is great, but I've also seen companies that have gone on for 5 to 7 to 9 to 10 years because they were so afraid of dilution that they wanted only non-dilutive funding. And the most dilutive thing in the world is undercapitalization. If you don't have the money to get it done, you get really diluted in the long run.
And in fact, those grants are really taxing in terms of the requirements. After they give you the grant, the reporting requirements, I mean, you might need a whole department working on that just to report back what you're doing with the money.
I think you have to be really careful with data requests by VCs. Like, it's total BS. And this year has been full of venture shenanigans like no year I've ever seen, right? So I take any data request from a VC that's not writing me a check with a total grain of salt. And if it's coming from somebody who's done full diligence on you, has deep expertise on what you're working on, and they're really thoughtfully telling you you're missing some key data, then you should work with them to figure out how to solve that. Otherwise, I would balance that feedback against what you're hearing from the big pharmas, right? If the R&D team at Pfizer says, hey, like, this is really interesting, but you're missing this key in vivo experiment that we really rely on internally, go do that experiment, right? But across this year, if you looked at all the Series A investments led by top-tier VCs in biotech, how many of them had 0 in vivo data? Many of them. So just this year is a lot of shenanigans.
That was one of the most polite turns of phrase I've ever heard.
They're
done.
struggling, right? Like, remember what I said at the beginning. Like, their livelihoods are at risk because their clients are running out of money. They're nervous people right now.
Which doesn't mean that they shouldn't return your calls and have a thorough discussion with you.
And nobody's going to say, hey, I'm running out of money. They're going to say, hey, you're missing in vivo data.
Okay, now you're getting a little less polite, but I like that. We're going to shift gears for a moment because Yanni has an unusual expertise, which I want to make sure is included in this panel as well. But before I go to Yanni, any follow-up questions on this aspect of things? And then we're going to come back to the business development dynamics in the world, which are equally vexing or full of shenanigans, to use your phrase. Please, yeah.
So while I do believe that many groups are full of shenanigans, there are groups that there are plenty of, I've talked to plenty of groups who are raising new funds. And I am kind of curious with regards to how you're viewing the behavior of groups that have raised a new fund, say, this year, last year, versus the traditional investors.
You want to start? You're in the process of it, as am I. But
Yeah. So I think they're not as directly affected. Like if anybody's sitting on dry powder, right, they're much better off than somebody who, went out and raised $1 billion biotech fund 3 years ago and we're expecting to raise a new fund now, and now they're stuck, right? So groups like SR1 and Cure Ventures and Bioluminescence and AN, like there's a lot of new funds that are out there. They all have slightly unique strategies, right? So you have to fit into what they're doing. But they're still sort of indirectly affected by the environment because they need to syndicate. And so there's just real hesitancy to put term sheets out right now. And I think term sheets, everyone's nervous that they're going to overprice or not be able to pull around together, and then they look bad to their partnership. So this is the shenanigans I'm talking about. Everything's taking longer. Getting to a term sheet is taking longer. Once you have a term sheet, syndication's taking longer. I'm seeing things that I don't think I'd ever seen in my career before, like conditions, like tranche milestones for the first tranche of a round, right? So it's like, you must generate this additional data before I will close this financing. So it's better than not having, it's better than them saying come back with in vivo data, right? They're actually putting pen to paper. But it's sort of like, well, if you're worried that they won't get this data, then why would you put this term sheet out? So you think they're going to get the data, and actually it's going to take 6 weeks for the lawyers to get through the documents anyway. Like they'll have the data. Why is this even here, right? Or one group, they were syndicating, and it was taking a long time. It was like, hey, you guys should do a first close, because if you do a first close, then you can go out and syndicate with much more leverage, right? If you send the CEO out to fundraise with money in the bank, it will come together much faster. They were very uncomfortable doing that. And instead they ended up doing convertible safe into the round because they want to keep the science going. But now they're in financially, but they haven't given the guy the leverage he needs to actually close the round. So, but they're just, everyone's nervous, right? So even if they have dry powder, they're still nervous about who doesn't have dry powder, right? But those are the groups you want to target. Anybody who announced a new fund in the last 18 months, go talk to them. Go talk to the corporates, right? Especially the corporates whose EPS is growing. Don't talk to the corporates whose EPS is shrinking. So,
It is a financial risk transfer process. And so when the further down the line is constrained, as it has been, it's harder and harder. The money has to last longer and longer. If you look at the stats historically, first-time funds actually do better than a lot of well-established funds. However, it's an 80-20 rule. There are funds that can do extremely well and push that first-time fund into the stratosphere. But most first-time funds, first of all, are not de novo funds. They're people that have worked in venture capital before. They've spun out of other funds. They have a track record. It may be a slightly new partnership. Those are the people that are able to raise first-time funds, because de novo funds are almost impossible to raise at the present time. With that, they've made promise to limited partners. They're going to stay close to the lane. They're not going to take risks. And not to be pejorative, you can't blame them. They have a responsibility, and they've got to get to the next fund. And the only way you get to the next fund is by demonstrating competence in the fund that you're in. So I think at the moment we are in a blocked pipe to a degree, but it is opening up. I think we're starting to see flow. And I don't make that much of a distinction between first-time funds and established funds so much as you make distinctions around the discipline that has to go into the capital. But let me shift gears for a moment, and then we're going to come back to this subject because it's critically relevant to the business development issue. Yanni, in this era of capital constraint, I think there are a bunch of people here in the audience and on presumably streaming this, where proper preservation of capital doesn't only mean prioritization of pipeline and focus and avoidance of wasted capital in the science or the R&D. It actually has to do as well with how your operating expenditures are going. Can you talk to a little bit to us about the different models in real estate and modular laboratories and things that you're seeing that impact young companies? Because obviously this is a critical part of our infrastructure.
Sure. And certainly we talk about the great happiness being the past 10 years. Thank you for that phrase. But thank you also for...
It came from the tech era. That's how old it is.
Fair enough. Thanks also for referring to my expertise as unique. Most rooms, it's like a dime a dozen, so I appreciate that in the real estate business. But what we saw 24 months ago, even 18 months ago, were companies that had no business making very long-term, 10 to 15-year, extremely capital-intensive commitments, leasing huge amounts of space on a prospective, speculative basis. A lot of echoes to what happened in the late 90s and early 2000s with tech companies. But these were companies with some promising science who were optimists. They were backed by capital sources that were similarly optimistic and willing to make very significant long-term commitments. And ultimately, a lot of that capital ended up getting tied up in equipment, in lease liabilities, and in other, perhaps less productive priorities. When we talk about some of the ways in which capital should be prioritized, especially in an early stage company. So we saw companies that had 10, 15, 20,000 square feet signing leases for 80, 100, 150,000 square feet. So again, a lot of echoes to the late 90s, early 2000s. And now what we see is much of that space has been built out with the venture capital money and other capital sources. Those companies have either contracted and are subleasing space or have gone out entirely or have been acquired and moved somewhere else. And so there is now a lot of second-generation space, relatively new or brand-new second-generation space that's available for smaller users. And in smaller companies that may desire greater flexibility long-term and are getting a little bit smarter, a little bit more disciplined about the type of capital commitments that they're making and the preservation of that capital. And so, we always talk about in our business making sure that the deals that we do, the leases that we sign, are for the right space at the right time in a company's trajectory. Because inevitably, if you don't adhere to that kind of discipline, you end up with buildings that are vacant, second-generation space that can't be subleased, lease liabilities that go unfulfilled in the worst-case type of scenarios if there's a bankruptcy or some other type of event. And so we always try to be somewhat disciplined about that. Now, as the industry has evolved and we have more and more early-stage companies that need to do more and more intensive science, we've seen lots of new products pop up, whether they're modular lab type facilities so that laboratory equipment can be configured in easily flexible ways, or whether they're products like Lab Central and Smart Labs and some of the shared research type environments, which will go out and as a surrogate for the end user, lease space on a bulk basis and then turn around and and sublease that space or license that space to individual companies. So we've certainly seen a lot of that type of activity over the past 24 months with some mixed degree of results. That space too is incredibly capital intensive, and that's also that's a risky business. You're depending on the overall health of the industry to drive those results. But what we're seeing now, especially for earlier stage or smaller companies, is that there is a great deal of sublease space out there. Of all different sizes, all different durations, all different configurations. So if capital becomes available, to put down roots or to grow a little bit, there are a lot of choices. That's at one end of the spectrum, and we can talk about the other end of the spectrum, the much larger users, maybe in a moment. But.
Great, thank you, and I think it emphasizes the point that everything is strategic, not just indication, not just science, not just R&D, but financing is strategic, real estate is strategic. And I think we in our industry tend to underestimate the different things that lead us to success. It's not all about the thing that excites us the most often in our industry, which is, can we actually, frankly, create a greater good for the world and actually come up with something that truly helps patients. But in order to get there, you actually have to be disciplined in every aspect. Let me shift a little bit to business development, David, because I think this is something that, we've talked a lot about capital so far in terms of its constraints, throughout the cycle. And traditionally, as I said earlier, I think you see M&A licensing and partnering take an inversely proportional level of activity to the capital environment, the equity capital markets. But for the last few years, that actually hasn't been the case. Everything has been somewhat constrained, and there are a variety of reasons for it. We've been talking about it, in the green room or whatever color that room was, whether it's the IRA or whether it's just general regulatory policy. But you've been doing this for a long time. Give us your sense of where the markets are at the moment for larger company to smaller company interactions, and what are the drivers there?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things there. I think with the IRA, which is looming over everyone's head, is people are looking. They're not looking at small molecules. They aren't looking at mass markets. They're looking at more the orphan drug. But that does open up the ability to in-license and to find partners for the mass markets. So when you look at GI or cardiorenal with small molecules, there's a number of stuff out there, and there are people looking to do deals. Now, whether that's because they can't find anybody else to fund them because they're looking at what they're going to have to reduce their market price at, but there are good drugs out there, and there's a lot in Europe trying to find a place here. So, I mean, I would urge going ex-US, Japan, Europe. There's a lot of stuff there that's been through phase 3 clinical trials or have been through large phase 2s that they're trying to do international phase 3s, that there's a lot of interesting things there. That's where I would start, and I think there is a lot there, especially for the mid-size companies that have money to spend.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on. We spend a ton of time in Europe, both for European companies. We spend a ton of time here in the United States with companies of all sizes, because there is, for want of a better expression, there's a bit of an arbitrage opportunity. I think Europe has been traditionally incredibly capital efficient, which is to its benefit most of the time, sometime to its deficit, because small companies that are drip fed end up, again, it can be dilutive capital because you don't hit those inflection points that we were referring to earlier. But when you do have smaller amounts of capital going in, more efficient use of that capital, discipline around inflection points, then those business development elements will come through. That said, it can also be, I think, somewhat difficult for the other side, because I think the discipline around valuation and structure has only increased over the last few years. Whether it's the IRA and related to small molecules. I mean, if you speak to Lilly, on the one hand, they're huge supporters of the IRA in some regards, and yet they're extremely concerned about valuation and in the bulk of their portfolio, which is mostly small molecules. So I think, this all cuts both ways, but I think we have seen parallel development of valuation discipline, structure discipline coming into business development and corp dev, as much as we've seen in the venture and the public market discipline as well. So Vikas and Carolina, I don't know if you want to comment on this from your perspectives of smaller companies or from a funding perspective.
Yeah, of course. So in terms of M&As and licensing and other deals, small companies are more than ever open to that. Obviously, there's no capital, so a lot of companies are looking for strategics. And I think that big pharma or big biopharma has been a little bit slow to react. We've seen a couple of great deals in the last few months, but not earlier on in the year, in my view. And I think big pharma can get great deals out there with great science and data and things that can bring a lot of benefit to patients. Actually, AbbVie just did 2 acquisitions back to back in the last couple of weeks. So, that's an example of somebody that reacted a little late. And, although they found great companies, I mean, one of them was Cerevel here in Massachusetts. I think that there's so many opportunities out there for big pharma to go out and acquire, great teams, and even incorporate the team into their team. Not only just doing co-development funding, but also bringing the people in and starting a new area. A lot of companies are doing that. So I'd say that environment to me is now more active than the funding environment.
Because
Yeah, I think the question is really more like, how do you make yourself attractive to that audience, right? I think it's, I think fundamentally work on things that you can pick up at CVS. If one day your drug can be picked up at CVS, it will be of interest to the pharma industry. And maybe your innovation will eventually get there. That's what your job is, right? And if it's going to go into CVS and go into a big patient population, it will drive EPS, and then they will want what you have. And they will need it, because even if the IRA reduces the pricing power, it also decreases the amount of time of exclusivity effectively. And so they will need your product even sooner. And so that's just, I think it's always not like, they're not going to come by you because valuations are down. Like, that's not how the pharma industry thinks. They only want the things that are on strategy for them. So you should make yourself on strategy for them. And I think one way of doing that is make yourself something that one day someone can pick up at CVS. Antibodies were not that when they started. They are now. Insulin was not that when it started in the 20s. When did we just, right, in the 20s?
1926, I think, but I'm not sure.
You have to, like, get a pig, right? Like, this, now you just get it at CVS. This is where you want to be eventually, right? This is how you make an impact on the world.
Because was deeply influenced by that Journal of American Medical Association.
No,
It's been
Annals of
really-
Internal Medicine.
Oh, the Annals of Internal Medicine. I'm sorry. Saw that also. Can I call on an audience member? Michal, can I punish you and hand you a microphone? So my old friend here from J&J. You're going to talk about your counsel for companies at the moment in terms of really being able to approach larger companies. Give us your counsel. Should they approach early before they're ready? Should they have conversations? What's the tone in your neck of the woods? We have the nice opportunity of having you be in my line of sight, so I had to do that to you. Sorry.
Happy to. So thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to the panel, and Michal Preminger from J&J Innovation. So it is not by chance that in this neighborhood, every one of the largest 20 and many other pharma companies are here. They're here to have those conversations early. And these are important for a number of reasons. First, from the startup side, right? It is an opportunity to understand the particular needs and expectations and design the programs to be able to deliver the right data package, the level of rigor, use the right models, avoid some wrong turns on the way by getting that advice. And all companies, again, are here and open to this. And even if they say it's too early for us, the process has started. The relationship is now being developed. From the large company perspective, it is an opportunity to do a couple of things. First, it's to provide input that will eventually lead to the shaping of an asset or a set of assets that are better suited for the strategy. And the other thing is really about having enough information to start the process of internal education. So if you're doing something very novel, sometimes it is not obvious to everyone within the R&D organization, the commercial organization in pharma, that this has the right value, that it will be adopted. And there needs to be an internal journey that mirrors your own in figuring out how it works. And the earlier in the process, the teams that are here intentionally in order to engage with new ideas and new potential products, they can mobilize earlier and they can have that runway that they need in order to prepare their organizations for their business development activity or investment. So there is absolutely no reason why this should not happen. I think our ecosystem is the best in the world in making this happen. So please take advantage. We're all here for that reason. Does that help?
It does, and thank you for joining us. One comment to make as well is that make sure you find your advocacy. I think very early stage companies tend to focus on R&D, and that's usually where the advocacy is. But budgets often come from commercial, and I think you can't forget about that. And this sort of broad-based engagement of finding your scientific champions, finding your development champions, articulating a commercial vision, to go back to what Vikas was speaking about, and then as the final common pathway, the biz dev and the corp dev engagement in order to put structure and details around this. It's all part of it, and I think if you only engage in one direction, you may lose the advocacy for the rest of the ecosystem that you have. Go ahead, Vikas, please.
I think the audience is also the audiences of investors versus pharma. They kind of like different things. So with investors, I don't think they really want to know the sausage making. I don't think investors really want to know that. I think pharma really does. I think they want to see all the nitty gritty failed experiments, what you tried, why it didn't work, what bad experience you had with this vendor. They're living through it just like you are. They want to help you. And they want to feel like you're honest about the data that you're sharing. And so if you share the sausage making and you bring the junior scientists into the meeting, they'll trust you more. I don't think you should ever do that for investors, right? Or you have to do it very carefully with certain investors. So you need to have like different sales approaches because they are different audiences who have different expectations.
Agree. So, other questions from the audience, and then I think we'll be closing out soon. But any other questions that are, please?
I'm going to take the opportunity to get the panel's opinion on the Sanofi Maze. FTC just blocked the Sanofi Maze partnership, and so I'm kind of curious from the details that you guys are aware of Maze and how early they are, how you think that might impact future deal making?
I mean, the FTC is just like picking battles right now that they don't have any expectation of actually winning, right? Like, so this is just, I don't know the details of the Sanofi Maze, but the FTC is aggressively interfering in the pharmaceutical industry. Every collaboration is going to get an SEC investigation. There's huge scrutiny on our industry at the very senior levels. The recent announcement from the Biden administration around walking in on patents, but it's just politics, right? And so I think we just have to focus on what our job is, which is our job is to make sure patients don't need gastric surgery anymore. They can just pick up generic Prilosec, CVS branded at CVS, right? Like that's our job. And these other things will work themselves out.
Yeah, I mean, over many years of doing this, whenever a deal gets announced, the phone rings from 20 investors or 20 companies that see the deal and say, well, that deal got done. Why can't my deal get done? And the vagaries of why deals get done changes. I don't know the details of this. I haven't studied it, so I can't really comment on it directly. But what I would say is that although there are seminal events that start to open up markets and make people more ready, and I think it tends to have to do with scientific and development successes in our field tends to create more optimism. That's positive, although it has to still translate into fund flows one way or the other. Failures repetitively also create pessimism, and then you start having regulatory impositions on top of that, or political issues, or macroeconomic or geopolitical issues, and then markets retract. At the end of the day, though, I've been doing this for a long time, I really believe that we are in a fundamentally driven business. And yes, we have to satisfy investors' returns profiles, so we have to match the asset to the capital. And yes, we have to have inflection points that are, if not completely predictable, because we know the failure rates along each of the stages, at least are predictable within the confines of what is not false precision. And then we also have to have indications that work, whether it's on a biologic subset where the pricing is very high, or whether it's Prilosec, or fascinatingly, because when you speak to gastric bypass surgeons these days, obesity surgeons, they all say, who would want to take a drug for the rest of your life? And the answer is everybody. And sorry, you're going to have trouble in years to come. So, but I do think we're really fundamentally driven, and I think we need to be way less reactive to single deals and more reactive to exactly what it is we're planning out with regard to our company's health, and understand they're going to be really crappy times. I'm streaming, so I wasn't going to. Really shenanigan-ridden times. Is that the new euphemism we're using? Really full of shenanigans, as you so nicely said, or really good times. And I just think stick to the fundamentals and make sure that your capital, your runway, matches the macroeconomic environment and it's tied to fundamentals. So that was actually my last 2 cents. Let's go through the panel, and in your areas of expertise, you guys give your last 2 cents, and then we're standing between you and cocktails, so this is a very dangerous place to be.
Just stay focused. Don't try to do too many things and waste your money trying to do 10 things. Do 1 or 2 really well.
Stay optimistic. I think there are some good news lately, like the approval of the first CRISPR-based therapy for sickle cell, for example. And I'm more into advanced therapies that might never get into CVS, I'm sorry. But we're talking about, gene therapies and non-viral, for example, nucleic acid-based therapies and things like that. I see the next 10 years as a wonderful scientific advancement, decade. And we're going to see therapies that we never thought we were going to see in our lifetime. And this is going to be all transformative to patients suffering from specific diseases. So stay tuned, because some great scientific advances are coming. Whether we want to fund them or not, that's a different question, but they are coming. So stay optimistic.
I forget who said this, but it was like a really famous industrialist said this. When they're passing peas, eat peas. Right? And so it just takes so long to develop a medicine. Markets will go up, they will go down. Sometimes SPACs are happening, sometimes reverse mergers are happening, sometimes IPOs are happening. You just can't predict where it's going to be in a few years. When they are giving you peas, take the peas and make it work. And just get the data you need, and eventually you'll make it through all of that, right? And it just takes so long to make a medicine, these economic cycles will affect us.
I think especially for earlier stage companies and innovation and discovery, there has been such an incredible amount of capital invested in space, in real estate, over the past 3 to 5 years. Much of it's still current in terms of what it is, the physical plant that's been created. And there's never been more opportunity to take advantage of that invested capital by others for your own endeavors. So especially smaller companies will never have more choices, or have historically never had more choices in terms of geography, in terms of real estate, in terms of fit, in terms of durational flexibility than exists today. And that's a really important foundational fundamental for innovation and for the industry to thrive. For larger users, there's still many fewer options. But for earlier stage companies, take advantage of all the money that's been spent on incredible spaces to do your science as well.
And with that, I'll thank Michal for her cameo appearance here at MassBio, and tell you that the thing they will never cure among biotechnology entrepreneurs is manic optimistic disorder. And with that, please join me in thanking the panel and all of you for being here tonight.
Thank you.
And I think we're being served. Thanks to all online.